Before the world learned of the horrific murders of Maggie and Paul Murdaugh, Alex Murdaugh was already a man living a double life, a life of secrets, deception, and dark schemes that stretched back years before that fatal night. He was the heir to one of South Carolina's most powerful legal dynasties, a man trusted by his clients, loved by his community, but behind closed doors, he was hiding a trail of lies, fraud, and scandal. From embezzling millions and covering up deaths to planning crimes most couldn't imagine, Alex Murdaugh's past was a ticking time bomb. And now, we're about to uncover the chilling chain of events that led a man once seen as untouchable to commit the ultimate betrayal, murdering his own family. The shocking truth isn't just in what happened on that night. It's in what Alex Murdaugh did for years before. Stay with us, because what you're about to hear will reveal the dark patterns, the secret scandals, and the warnings that everyone ignored until it was too late. This is Dark Crime Casefiles, where no crime stays in the dark. To truly understand Alex Murdaugh, we must step back and look at the dynasty he was born into, a family whose influence on South Carolina's legal system spanned nearly a century. The Murdaughs were not just lawyers, they were an institution. For generations, they held sway over the Low Country's courts, shaping the lives of countless families, businesses, and politicians. Their name carried weight, a name synonymous with authority, trust, and, in some circles, untouchable power. Alex was born into this legacy, the eldest son expected to carry the family torch. He grew up surrounded by privilege and expectation, summers on the family's sprawling estate, a community that treated him like royalty, and a professional path that seemed preordained. Law was in his blood. By the time he reached adulthood, Alex had completed law school, joined the family firm, and quickly cemented himself as a rising star in the legal world. To the outside world, Alex Murdaugh was the perfect son, husband, and father. He appeared charming, dedicated, and reliable, the kind of man communities trust with their most sensitive legal matters. But beneath the polished exterior, cracks were beginning to form. Early signs of secrecy, questionable choices, and moral compromises were quietly emerging, subtle enough to escape public scrutiny but persistent enough to sow the seeds of later scandal. While most knew him as the heir to a powerful family, only a few glimpsed the complexities beneath, the pressures of maintaining a dynasty, the temptations of unchecked privilege, and the private battles that would eventually consume him. His personal life, though seemingly normal, was already marked by patterns of deception, early brushes with controversy, and a growing reliance on secrecy to protect the Murdaugh name and himself. By all appearances, Alex's life was enviable, a high-profile attorney, a prominent social figure, a father, a husband, and a man with a legacy behind him. Yet, for every accolade and courtroom victory, there were moments hidden from public view. Client funds mismanaged, small lies told to cover personal mistakes, and early lapses in judgment that would, over time, grow more dangerous. And though no one could have predicted the horror that would unfold in June 2021, the foundations were quietly being laid, a combination of privilege, deceit, and unchecked ambition that would ultimately culminate in a tragedy that would shock not just South Carolina, but the entire nation. The story of Alex Murdaugh is a cautionary tale, a reminder that appearances can be deceiving and that power and trust, when misused, can lead to devastating consequences. What follows is not just a chronicle of the murders. It is an examination of the dark, tangled path that Alex Murdaugh had been walking for years, long before anyone ever imagined he could commit the unthinkable. As Alex Murdaugh's reputation continued to grow throughout the early 2010s, so did the quiet warning signs, subtle at first, almost invisible beneath the weight of his family name. From the outside, Alex appeared to be thriving. He was handling high-value legal cases, representing vulnerable clients, and operating with the full trust of both his law firm and the community. But behind the scenes, a different story was beginning to take shape, one defined by shortcuts, secrecy, and a growing disregard for ethical boundaries. During this period, Alex was entrusted with managing settlements for clients who depended on him during the most devastating moments of their lives. These were people injured in accidents, families grieving sudden losses, individuals who relied on Alex not only as a lawyer, but as a protector. And yet, It was during these years that investigators would later uncover the first signs of financial misconduct: settlement funds that didn't reach their intended recipients, payments quietly redirected, and paperwork manipulated to conceal missing money. At the time, few questioned these irregularities. The Murdaugh name carried an unspoken assumption of integrity. Clients trusted him, colleagues deferred to him, and any inconsistencies were either overlooked or explained away, dismissed as clerical errors, timing issues, or misunderstandings. But in reality, these were the early building blocks of a much larger scheme, one that would eventually unravel everything. Then, in 2018, an incident occurred that would become one of the most disturbing chapters in the Murdaugh saga: the death of the family's longtime housekeeper, Gloria Satterfield. Gloria had worked for the Murdaugh family for decades. She was more than an employee. She was described as a trusted presence in the household, someone who helped raise Alex's children and was deeply woven into the family's daily life. In February of that year, Gloria died after an incident at the Murdaugh property. What initially appeared to be a tragic accident soon raised troubling questions. Following her death, Alex Murdaugh encouraged Gloria's sons to pursue a civil claim, assuring them he would help them receive justice and financial support. A lawsuit was filed, and a settlement was reached, one reportedly worth millions. But here's where the story takes a darker turn. According to later investigations, Gloria's family never received the money they were owed. Instead, prosecutors would allege that Alex orchestrated a scheme to divert the settlement funds into accounts he controlled, disguising the transactions and forging documentation to make it appear legitimate. For years, the family believed the case was still ongoing, unaware that the settlement had already been paid and that the money had vanished. This wasn't just financial misconduct. It was a betrayal of trust at the most personal level, exploiting a family grieving the loss of a loved one who had spent her life serving the Murdaugh household. And yet, even then, no criminal charges were filed. The system that had protected Alex for so long continued to shield him, allowing the deception to remain hidden in plain sight. By the end of 2018, the pattern was becoming clearer, at least in hindsight. Alex Murdaugh had learned that he could manipulate systems, redirect money, and silence questions without immediate consequences. Each success reinforced the belief that he was untouchable. These were the seeds of corruption, planted quietly, nurtured by privilege, and allowed to grow unchecked. And while no one yet connected the dots, the foundations were being laid for a collapse that would come years later, with devastating consequences. Years before the deaths of Maggie and Paul Murdaugh, and even before the tragedy involving Gloria Satterfield, another unexplained death lingered quietly in the background of the Lowcountry. In July of 2015, 19-year-old Stephen Smith was found dead on a rural road in Hampton County, South Carolina. The initial ruling labeled his death a hit and run. But almost immediately, investigators noticed inconsistencies that didn't align with a typical roadway accident. Stephen's injuries raised questions. There was no debris from a vehicle, no broken side mirrors, no skid marks. And despite the rural setting, there was little physical evidence to conclusively support the theory that a car had struck him. Yet, despite these red flags, the case stalled, and ultimately went cold. What followed was years of uncertainty and unanswered questions for Stephen's family. They pushed for further investigation, believing that the truth about how Stephen died had never been fully uncovered. Rumors circulated quietly within the community, whispers that powerful names might be connected to the case, but nothing concrete ever emerged publicly. At the time, the name Murdaugh surfaced only in rumor, not in official findings. No charges were filed. No direct evidence linked Alex Murdaugh or his family to Stephen's death. Still, the mere presence of those rumors spoke to something larger, a growing perception that certain families operated beyond scrutiny, insulated by influence and silence. For years, Stephen Smith's case remained a tragic footnote, an unresolved mystery overshadowed by more visible scandals. But everything changed in 2021. During the investigation into the murders of Maggie and Paul Murdaugh, authorities reportedly uncovered information that prompted them to reopen Stephen Smith's case. The timing alone was unsettling. A death that had long been dismissed was suddenly back under review, raising the possibility that critical details had been overlooked or ignored from the very beginning. While investigators have been careful not to draw premature conclusions, the reopening of the case reignited public attention and deepened scrutiny around the Murdaugh family's past. For many, it reinforced the idea that Alex Murdaugh's world was surrounded by unanswered questions, not just financial or legal, but deeply human ones involving loss, secrecy, and silence. Stephen Smith's death may not have been officially tied to Alex Murdaugh, but its presence in the larger narrative is impossible to ignore. It represents something darker than any single crime, a culture where questions went unanswered, where doubt lingered without resolution, and where truth seemed perpetually out of reach. By the time the case was reopened, the image of Alex Murdaugh as a respected legal figure had already begun to crumble. And with each past incident revisited, one thing became increasingly clear. The story of the Murdaughs wasn't just about what was known, it was about what had been left unexplored for years. As unanswered questions continued to surround unexplained deaths and quiet scandals, another pattern was unfolding, one that would ultimately expose the true foundation of Alex Murdaugh's life: money. For years, Alex operated with almost complete financial autonomy. Within his law firm, he was trusted implicitly, not just because of his role, but because of his last name. That trust allowed him to manage settlements, client funds, and legal payouts with minimal oversight. And it was during this time that the first true cracks in the Murdaugh empire began to widen. Behind closed doors, settlement checks were being diverted. Client payouts were delayed, reduced, or never delivered at all. In some cases, victims were told their cases were still pending, even after money had already been paid out. Documents were altered, paper trails were blurred, and explanations, when requested, were vague but convincing enough to avoid deeper scrutiny. What made these irregularities so difficult to detect was Alex's position. He wasn't an outsider exploiting the system, he was the system. He understood legal procedures, insurance structures, and trust accounts better than most. That knowledge allowed him to exploit gaps, manipulate timelines, and redirect funds without raising immediate alarms. Clients who questioned missing money often found themselves reassured by Alex's confidence and authority. After all, this was a Murdaugh, a man whose family had spent generations upholding the law. Few imagined that the very person sworn to protect their interests might be exploiting them instead. Over time, these financial discrepancies grew more frequent and more severe. Small misappropriations became larger transfers. Isolated incidents turned into a pattern. Yet, remarkably, the system still did not intervene. Internally, concerns were either overlooked or never formally documented. Externally, victims lacked the power, resources, or knowledge to challenge a prominent attorney backed by decades of influence. This era marked a critical shift. What had once been isolated acts of misconduct now appeared to be something far more deliberate. A methodical approach to deception fueled by confidence, entitlement, and the belief that consequences would never come. By the late 2010s, Alex Murdaugh was no longer simply bending the rules. He was relying on a financial house of cards to sustain his lifestyle, his addictions, and his image. Each stolen dollar bought him more time. Each unchecked transaction reinforced the illusion of control. And while none of this was public knowledge yet, the damage was already done. The trust of clients had been violated. The integrity of the legal system had been quietly undermined. And Alex Murdaugh had crossed a line from privilege into predation, targeting those who could least afford to fight back. These early financial irregularities were more than crimes of greed. They were warning signs, proof that Alex Murdaugh had learned he could deceive, manipulate, and exploit without immediate consequence. And as history would soon reveal, once those boundaries were crossed, there would be no turning back. By early 2019, the quiet misconduct and hidden scandals surrounding Alex Murdaugh had not yet reached public view. But on the night of February 24th, everything changed. That evening, a group of young adults, including Alex's youngest son, Paul Murdaugh, spent hours moving between bars and social gatherings along South Carolina's low-country waterways. Alcohol flowed freely, and as the night wore on, judgment steadily eroded. Just after midnight, the group boarded a small boat to travel back home. Conditions on the water were dark and cold. Visibility was limited. Several passengers later recalled concern about Paul's behavior. He was allegedly intoxicated, argumentative, and difficult to reason with. Despite objections from others on board, Paul remained at the helm. As the boat sped through the narrow channel toward Archer's Creek Bridge, confusion and tension filled the vessel. Moments later, disaster struck. The boat crashed violently into a bridge piling. Passengers were thrown from their seats. Some were ejected into the water. Chaos followed in the darkness. When first responders arrived, the scene was frantic. Survivors were injured, disoriented, and in shock. But one passenger was missing, 19-year-old Mallory Beach. A search was launched immediately, extending through the night and into the following days. Nearly a week later, Mallory's body was recovered several miles downstream. The loss devastated her family and sent shockwaves through the community. What began as a late-night outing among friends had ended in irreversible tragedy. In the immediate aftermath, attention quickly turned to the Murdaugh name. Paul's identity as the son of a powerful local attorney was impossible to ignore. At the crash site and in the hours that followed, witnesses later described a sense of confusion, not just from the trauma of the accident, but from the presence of influence and authority woven into the unfolding response. Alex Murdaugh arrived at the hospital where survivors were being treated. His presence, according to later accounts, was noticeable and commanding. Questions were asked. Stories were exchanged. But in those first critical hours, no clear narrative emerged, only fragments, emotions, and uncertainty. What was undeniable, however, was this. A young woman had lost her life, families were forever changed, and the Murdaugh name was now attached to a tragedy that could not be quietly buried. This moment marked a turning point. For the first time, the family's private world of influence and discretion collided with public scrutiny. And while the legal consequences had yet to unfold, the events of that night would ignite a chain reaction, one that would expose patterns long hidden beneath the surface. In the hours and days following the boat crash, what happened next would ignite widespread controversy, not just because of the tragedy itself, but because of how authorities responded. As investigators worked to piece together the events of that night, questions quickly arose about accountability. Survivors described confusion at the scene. Statements varied. And critically, no sobriety test was administered to Paul Murdaugh at the time of the crash, a detail that would later become a focal point of public outrage. Paul was eventually identified as the alleged driver of the boat, and the investigation moved forward. In April of 2019, he was formally charged with multiple felony counts, including boating under the influence causing death and bodily injury. The charges were serious, carrying the potential for significant prison time. But from the very beginning, many in the community believed the case was unfolding differently than it would have for an ordinary defendant. Paul was not immediately detained. He was released on bond. And despite the severity of the charges, life for the Murdaugh family appeared to continue largely unchanged, at least on the surface. Law enforcement agencies faced intense scrutiny. Critics questioned whether the family's long-standing influence had affected how evidence was collected, how interviews were conducted, and how quickly decisions were made. Even routine investigative steps were re-examined under a microscope, fueling speculation and mistrust. Public perception shifted rapidly. What had initially been viewed as a tragic accident began to look, in the eyes of many, like a test of whether justice could be applied equally, regardless of power or last name. Media coverage intensified. Social media amplified outrage. And the Murdaugh family, once shielded by respect and tradition, found themselves under a level of scrutiny they had never faced before. For Alex Murdaugh, the situation was unprecedented. The legal system he had spent his life navigating was now turning its attention inward, toward his own family. Each court appearance, each headline, chipped away at the image of control and invincibility that had protected him for decades. Yet even as the case moved forward, delays mounted. Proceedings stretched on. Trial dates were postponed. And for the Beach family, justice seemed painfully slow. The longer the case lingered, the louder the public questions became, not just about the crash, but about whether the system itself was broken. This legal chaos marked a critical shift. The protective bubble surrounding Alex Murdaugh had begun to crack. And while the full consequences were still years away, the boat crash had done something no prior incident had accomplished. It placed the Murdaugh name under a relentless spotlight, one that would soon reveal far more than anyone expected. As criminal proceedings slowly moved forward, another battle was already unfolding, one that would strike at the Murdaugh family's finances and expose even deeper cracks beneath the surface. The family of Mallory Beach filed a wrongful death lawsuit, naming Paul Murdaugh and several others connected to the events of that night. The lawsuit alleged negligence, underage drinking, and a failure to prevent a foreseeable tragedy. But as the case expanded, its scope grew far beyond a single boating accident. Businesses were added as defendants. Allegations emerged that alcohol had been provided illegally to Paul and his friends. With each amendment to the lawsuit, the financial stakes increased, and so did the pressure on Alex Murdaugh. For the first time, Alex was not simply defending a client. He was defending his own family, his reputation, and potentially his livelihood. Depositions were scheduled. Financial records were requested. And the legal process began probing areas that had long remained private. Behind the scenes, settlements were discussed. Insurance policies were examined. Questions arose about coverage limits, liability, and who would ultimately bear the financial cost of Mallory Beach's death. What had once seemed like a manageable legal challenge began to resemble a looming financial crisis. At the same time, public scrutiny intensified. Every filing, every court appearance, and every delay was closely watched. Critics accused the Murdaugh family of attempting to use influence and legal maneuvering to shield themselves from consequences. Supporters argued the process was being unfairly politicized. But regardless of perspective, one thing was undeniable: the family was under unprecedented pressure. As months passed, the lawsuits dragged on, and the costs continued to mount. Legal fees accumulated. Insurance coverage became a critical concern. And for Alex Murdaugh, a man already quietly juggling financial irregularities behind closed doors, the crash had triggered a chain reaction he could no longer fully control. This civil litigation did more than seek accountability. It forced open doors that had remained shut for years. And as those doors began to open, they revealed a financial reality far more fragile than anyone had imagined. By the time the civil lawsuits were underway, it was becoming increasingly clear that the 2019 boat crash was not an isolated tragedy, it was a spotlight. For years, Alex Murdaugh had operated in a world where mistakes were absorbed quietly, questions dissolved quickly, and consequences rarely reached him. But the crash changed that dynamic. It pulled together threads that had long existed independently: questionable decisions, missing money, and a reliance on influence to smooth over problems. The response to the crash followed a familiar pattern: confusion at the scene, delays in accountability, authority stepping in where it didn't seem to belong. To many observers, it felt eerily similar to earlier incidents, moments where clarity was lost and responsibility became blurred. What stood out most was how Alex reacted under pressure. Rather than stepping back, he leaned further into control. He inserted himself into conversations. He managed narratives. He worked behind the scenes, attempting to contain damage, not just from the crash itself, but from what the investigation might uncover next. The lawsuits forced transparency in ways Alex was unprepared for. Financial disclosures threatened to expose years of hidden activity. Depositions created permanent records. For the first time, Alex could not rely solely on reputation to shield him. Every move was documented. Every explanation could be questioned. And that's when the broader picture began to take shape. The same man is accused of diverting settlement money. The same family is linked to unresolved controversies. The same patterns of secrecy, deflection, and delay. Viewed together, they painted a portrait not of coincidence but of consistency. The boat crash did what years of quiet misconduct could not. It disrupted the balance. It drew public attention to a family long accustomed to operating beyond it. And most importantly, it accelerated the collapse of a carefully constructed facade. From this point forward, the pressure on Alex Murdaugh would only intensify. Financial scrutiny would deepen. Trust would erode. And the sense of control he had maintained for so long would begin to slip away, setting the stage for decisions that would ultimately change everything. Because while the crash may have been an accident, what followed was not. It was the moment when patterns became visible, when secrets started surfacing, and when the path toward an unthinkable outcome was quietly, but unmistakably, set in motion. By early 2021, the consequences Alex Murdaugh had spent years avoiding were no longer theoretical. They were imminent. Behind the scenes, his financial world was unraveling. The same schemes that had quietly sustained his lifestyle, the diverted settlements, the hidden accounts, the fabricated explanations, were becoming impossible to conceal. And for the first time, the scrutiny wasn't coming from outsiders. It was coming from within his own law firm. Partners at the firm began asking pointed questions about missing money, specifically hundreds of thousands of dollars that could not be accounted for. Internal reviews revealed discrepancies that explanations could no longer cover. One figure in particular stood out: $792,000, money that had vanished without a legitimate paper trail. Alex was confronted. The trust that had protected him for decades evaporated almost overnight. Colleagues who had once deferred to him now demanded answers. And the pressure was immediate. Meetings were tense. Deadlines were imposed. The expectation was clear: explain the missing funds or face the consequences. At the same time, the legal walls were closing in from every direction. Civil lawsuits tied to the boat crash were still active. Financial disclosures loomed. Investigations were expanding. What had once been manageable problems were now converging into a single, suffocating crisis. Alex's carefully balanced system, borrowing from one account to cover another, delaying payments, inventing justifications, was no longer sustainable. Each attempt to buy time only deepened the hole. And with every passing day, the likelihood of exposure increased. For a man whose entire identity was built on control, reputation, and influence, this moment represented something he had never truly faced before: accountability. Not rumors, not whispers, but documented proof threatened to dismantle everything: his career, his finances, and the image he had spent a lifetime protecting. This was the collapse point, the moment when the empire stopped wobbling and began to fall. And as the pressure mounted, Alex Murdaugh was running out of options and running out of time. As the financial pressure closed in, the strain began to seep into every corner of Alex Murdaugh's personal life. What had once been carefully compartmentalized, work on one side, family on the other, was no longer separable. Inside the Murdaugh household, tension was growing. Lawsuits, headlines, and whispered accusations followed the family everywhere. Maggie and Paul were no longer shielded from the consequences of Alex's actions. Their names appeared in court filings. Their lives were discussed publicly, and the sense of security that had defined their world was steadily eroding. Alex's standing in the community deteriorated just as quickly. Colleagues distanced themselves. Longtime allies became cautious. The legal world that had once embraced him now viewed him with suspicion. Doors that had always been open began to close, and conversations that once flowed easily became strained or abruptly ended. At home, the pressure was relentless. Financial uncertainty loomed large. Assets were scrutinized. Conversations turned serious, urgent, and uncomfortable. The future, once assumed to be stable and prosperous, now felt unpredictable and fragile. Alex, by many accounts, appeared increasingly isolated. The confidence that once defined him gave way to visible stress. He was no longer managing crises quietly from behind the scenes. He was reacting to them in real time, often with little room to maneuver. For Maggie and Paul, life became defined by waiting. Waiting for legal outcomes, waiting for clarity, waiting for reassurance that never fully came. The weight of Alex's decisions pressed down on the family, altering relationships and reshaping daily life in ways that could not be undone. This period marked a profound shift. The collapse was no longer just professional or financial, it was personal. And as trust fractured and pressure intensified, the sense that something was deeply wrong became impossible to ignore. The walls were closing in, not just from the outside but from within. And as Alex Murdaugh's world grew smaller, darker, and more unstable, the warning signs were everywhere, even if no one yet understood what they were leading toward. As Alex Murdaugh's life continued to unravel, the warning signs were no longer subtle. They were present, documented, and discussed, and yet somehow never fully connected. In the months leading up to June 2021, Alex's interactions with law enforcement and colleagues grew increasingly strained. He was questioned more frequently. His explanations became more complicated. Timelines shifted. Details changed. Small inconsistencies emerged, the kind that might seem insignificant on their own but are troubling when viewed together. There were moments that stood out in hindsight. Phone calls that didn't quite align with known timelines. Decisions that seemed illogical for a seasoned attorney. Reactions that appeared detached or out of sync with the gravity of the situations unfolding around him. At the time, these moments were brushed aside, attributed to stress, exhaustion, or the overwhelming pressure he was under. Alex continued to insist that everything was under control, even as evidence suggested otherwise. To those around him, he presented confidence where certainty no longer existed. To investigators, he offered cooperation paired with explanations that raised more questions than they answered. What no one recognized in that moment was how dangerous this combination had become: mounting legal pressure, collapsing finances, fractured relationships, and a man desperate to regain control of a life slipping beyond his grasp. Each red flag existed in isolation. Each warning was treated as manageable, explainable, temporary. There was no single event that screamed catastrophe, only a steady accumulation of signs pointing toward a breaking point. By early June 2021, Alex Murdaugh stood at the center of multiple crises, all converging at once. His career was in jeopardy. His finances were exposed. His reputation was irreparably damaged. And the carefully constructed identity he had relied on for decades was rapidly disintegrating. No one knew what would happen next. But in hindsight, the question lingers, not whether the warning signs were there, but how many were missed. Because in the final days before the murders, the pieces were already in place. They simply had not yet been assembled into the devastating picture that would soon emerge. By the summer of 2021, the pressure surrounding Alex Murdaugh had reached a level prosecutors later described as catastrophic. Every system that had once protected him, his reputation, his firm, his finances, was failing at the same time. According to prosecutors, the murders were not random acts of violence, nor were they the result of a single emotional breaking point. They argued something far more calculated, that Alex Murdaugh was facing imminent exposure and that he believed drastic action could buy him time. His law firm was closing in on missing money. Financial disclosures threatened to reveal years of fraud. Lawsuits were advancing. Criminal investigations were no longer hypothetical. And the persona he had relied on for decades, trusted lawyer, respected family man, was collapsing in real time. Prosecutors contended that Alex understood something crucial. Once the financial crimes were fully exposed, there would be no recovery. His career would end. His influence would vanish. And the scrutiny would be relentless. In that context, they argued the murders served a purpose, not to solve his problems, but to interrupt them. A shocking, devastating crime would shift focus away from his financial misconduct. Investigations would pause. Questions would change. Sympathy would replace suspicion, at least temporarily. Rather than being seen as a man under investigation, Alex would be viewed as a victim, a grieving husband and father at the center of an unimaginable tragedy. According to the prosecution, this shift in narrative was not incidental, it was the motive. They pointed to timing, the confrontation at his law firm, the mounting legal threats, the proximity of those events to the night of June 7, 2021. In their view, these were not parallel storylines, they were converging ones. This theory did not rely on emotion alone. It relied on patterns. The same behavior seen for years, deception to delay consequences and manipulation to regain control, was now applied to the most extreme circumstances imaginable. And while the murders did momentarily halt the financial reckoning, prosecutors argued that the pause was temporary. because once investigators began looking closely, the same habits that had defined Alex's past would resurface. Only this time, they would leave a trail that could not be erased. On the evening of June 7, 2021, the long-running pressures surrounding Alex Murdaugh intersected with a moment that would permanently alter the course of the case and his life. According to Alex, the night began routinely. He said he had spent time at the family's rural property before leaving to visit his mother. When he later returned, he claimed he made a devastating discovery: Maggie and Paul were unresponsive near the property. At 10:07 p.m., Alex Murdaugh called 911. His voice conveyed urgency and shock. He told the dispatcher he had just arrived and found his wife and son, describing the scene as sudden and unexpected. First responders were dispatched immediately. In the initial hours, Alex presented himself as a cooperative witness. He offered explanations for his whereabouts, described his movements that evening, and spoke openly with investigators.
They are dead, aren't they? Just turn on those.
Yes, sir. That's what it looks like.
Granny. Maggie's all are dead. Where are you now? All right. Yeah, the police are here now. The police are here now.
Affirmative.
That's my brother.
Okay. When was the last time you were here with them? Or talked to them or anything like that?
It was earlier tonight. I don't know the exact time, but
Okay.
I left. I was probably gone an hour and a half from my mom's, and I saw them about 45 minutes before that.
Okay.
I rode around with Paul for 2 hours this afternoon in the pickup truck.
That's your son, Paul? Okay.
Somebody going to check them?
Yes, sir. They've already checked them.
They did check them?
Yes, sir.
It's official that they're dead?
Yes, sir. That's what it looks like.
I'm sorry.
No. You're fine.
I'm very sorry. Gotta call her parents.
What's her name?
Her name is Maggie Murdaugh. Margaret Brandstetter Murdaugh. How you doing?
What's her birthday?
9/15/68.
Okay. And what's your son's first name? You said Paul?
Paul Carey Murdaugh.
And what's his birthday?
Jason, do you have anybody
4.
coming through town that could stop and pick up that tent? I see lighting off in the distance.
What are they covering them up?
I got some getting dressed now, Sheriff. I'll have somebody stop and grab it.
Tell them they don't have to do that.
At the time, there was no immediate public indication that he was considered anything other than a grieving family member. But as investigators began piecing together the timeline, questions quietly emerged. The window of time between Alex's departure and return became a focal point. His descriptions of when he last saw Maggie and Paul, and what they were doing, would later be closely examined. In the early aftermath, attention centered on the tragedy itself. The financial investigations paused. Civil cases slowed. Sympathy poured in. The narrative shifted, just as prosecutors would later argue it was intended to. Yet even that first night, details were being recorded. Call logs were preserved. Statements were documented. Movements were noted. What seemed like routine procedure at the time would later become critical pieces of a much larger puzzle. June 7, 2021, was not just the night of a tragedy, it was the moment when every decision Alex Murdaugh had made over the years began to converge into a single, irreversible sequence of events. And while the full significance of that night was not immediately clear, investigators would soon begin revisiting it, minute by minute, statement by statement, searching for answers that had not yet been asked. As investigators began revisiting the events of June 7th, the focus gradually shifted from what had happened to what had been said. Alex Murdaugh's early statements were not immediately dismissed, but over time, they began to change. Details shifted. Timelines narrowed, then expanded.
To do this.
I understand.
Yeah.
I totally
Yeah.
understand.
Yeah.
So you don't have any problem
Yeah.
with it.
So, just start at the top, take your time.
Like when I came back here,
Sorry.
and I could see his brain on his... And I ran over. I tried to turn him over, and I don't know. I figured it out. His cell phone popped out of his pocket. I started to try to do something with it, thinking maybe, but then I put it back down really quickly. Then I went to my wife, and I could see.
Did you touch?
And I called 911 pretty much right away, and she was very good. I talked to her. I told her I was going to get off the phone to call some family members. I did that.
What family members did you call?
I called my brother Randy, and I called my brother John. And I tried to call a little boy, real good friend that's right around the corner from here, but I didn't get him.
Okay. What all was around Paul when you walked up?
Blood.
Anything else?
I mean, there were some body things, yes, sir.
I mean, like any other evidence? I know you said the phone fell out the pocket, but did you see anything else that didn't belong or shouldn't belong or that wasn't part of Paul?
No, sir, not the... No, sir.
How about Maggie?
No, sir.
You didn't see anything around them? What made you come out here tonight?
I went to... My mom's a late-stage Alzheimer's patient. My dad's in the hospital. My mom gets anxious when she does. I went to check on them and Maggie. Maggie's a dog lover, and she fools with the dogs. And I knew she'd gone to the kennel. I was at the house. I left the house and went to my mom's for just a little while. Tried to call her when I left. Texted her, no response. When I got back to the house was obviously nobody was in there, so I figured they're still up here fooling around. Paul was gonna be getting set up to plant. Our sunflower seeds got sprayed and died, and he was refiguring to plant the sunflower seeds. So I came back up here and I drove up and saw and called.
Had Maggie and Paul been arguing over anything?
No.
What was their relationship like?
Wonderful.
Wonderful. How about yours and Maggie's?
Wonderful. I mean, I'm sure we had little things here and there, but we had a wonderful marriage, wonderful relationship.
And yours and Paul's relationship?
As good as it could be.
How old was Paul?
22.
Okay. Have you talked with any of these guys tonight?
Talked with Nolan, yes, sir.
Is he out here?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
I tried to call Rogan, was one of the people he's the boy that I told you lives around the corner.
Okay.
That's very, he's just a good, helpful young man. You mind if I open the door really quickly?
Go right ahead. Do what you need to do. So is there anybody that you can think of that we need to talk to tonight? Is there a name that comes to mind?
I mean, I can't tell you anybody that I'm overly suspicious of off the top of my head.
Okay.
I mean, this is such a stupid thing. I'm even embarrassed to say it. But it just didn't make any sense. I just hired a guy out here, and he wasn't cutting the mustard, but I hadn't told him this yet. Paul's been working with him a lot. He killed the sunflower seeds in our dove field just recently, which is why Paul was here doing this. He told Paul a story the other day about how when he was in high school, he got in a fight with some black guys. And the FBI undercover team observed him fighting those guys and put him on an undercover team with 3 Navy SEALs. And their job was to kill radical Black Panthers. And they did that from Myrtle Beach to Savannah. Now, I really don't think this guy, is probably the person, but that's just so friggin'.
Yeah, that's kind of far-fetched story.
It's weird. But he was off today.
Okay.
He took his daddy to the doctor.
What's his name?
CB Rowe.
ROWE?
Yeah, and I sent him a message to text me earlier today about the sunflowers, and he called me back when I was on the way to my mom's house.
Did you talk to him at that time?
Briefly, I was on the phone with a lawyer friend of mine named Chris Wilson from Bamberg, so I told him I'd call him back tomorrow and see him in the morning.
When you briefly talked to Mr. Rowe, what was his demeanor or attitude? Or
I mean, it seemed normal. I mean, I asked him about the sunflowers, and so, I'm sure he's a little bit.
Where does he live?
I don't exactly know. Somewhere in Bronson.
Okay. Do you have his phone number?
I do.
You got it with you, closer?
I do.
His account of when he last saw Maggie and Paul evolved, subtle at first, but increasingly significant when placed alongside independent evidence. The most damaging contradiction emerged months later. Alex had repeatedly told investigators he was not present near his wife and son shortly before their deaths. But digital data told a different story. Phone records, step data, and vehicle information were examined in detail. Investigators identified activity that placed Alex at the property during a time frame he had previously denied. Even more significant was a short video recorded on Paul's phone, captured just minutes before his death, in which Alex's voice could be heard in the background.
Hey, he's got a bird in his mouth!
Hey, Bubba.
It's a guinea!
This is a chicken.
Come here, Bubba!
Come here, Cash.
Come here, Bubba!
Cash. Quit.
This moment became pivotal. Prosecutors argued it destroyed the credibility of Alex's timeline. What had once been explained as confusion or stress now appeared deliberate. And the pattern was familiar. The same behavior seen throughout his life, deflection, denial, and manipulation, was now being measured digitally. There was no room for reinterpretation, no influence to soften the facts. The data spoke clearly, and it contradicted him. As the case went to trial, prosecutors laid these inconsistencies side by side. Not to overwhelm the jury, but to illustrate continuity. This was not a man caught in a single lie, they argued. It was a man who had relied on deception for years, finally confronted by evidence that could not be negotiated. In the end, it was not one piece of evidence that unraveled Alex Murdaugh's story. It was the convergence of everything: the pressure, the motive, the lies, and the technology that preserved the truth when words could no longer conceal it. What began as a strategy to delay exposure had instead accelerated it. The same patterns that once protected him had now sealed his fate. And as the trial concluded, the story that had unfolded over decades was no longer one of influence or control but of accountability. When the story of Alex Murdaugh is viewed in full, it becomes clear that this was never just about one night, one crime scene, or even one family. It was the result of years, decades, of power operating without resistance. For a long time, warning signs surfaced quietly and disappeared just as quickly. Money went missing. Ethical lines were crossed. Influence filled the gaps where accountability should have existed. Each time consequences were delayed, the damage didn't stop. It compounded. What allowed it all to continue wasn't just secrecy. It was trust that went unquestioned. A reputation that went unchallenged. A system that mistook familiarity for integrity and authority for honesty. By the time scrutiny finally arrived, it wasn't entering a stable structure. It was entering a collapse already in progress. The financial crimes, the lies, the desperation, none of it appeared suddenly. It had been building for years, hidden in plain sight. The murders did not exist in isolation. They were preceded by choices, patterns, and missed moments where intervention could have changed the trajectory. Moments when accountability might have arrived earlier and didn't. Which leaves a question that lingers long after the facts are known and the verdicts are rendered. If power had been challenged sooner, if misconduct had been exposed earlier, could this tragedy have been prevented? There is no simple answer, but it's a question worth asking. Because stories like this are not only about what happened, they are about what was allowed to happen and how long it was tolerated before the cost became irreversible. If this case made you reflect on how unchecked influence can distort justice, consider subscribing to Dark Crime Casefiles, a place where stories are examined beyond the headlines and patterns are never ignored. Share your thoughts in the comments. Could earlier accountability have changed the outcome? This is Dark Crime Casefiles, where no crime stays in the dark,